Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Jenny Irons, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. Today, I'll be providing an overview of our funding program for Reducing Inequality research grants and provide some insights into what we look for and how we evaluate applications. Here's an outline of what I'll be talking about today. First, I'll give you a brief overview of the Foundation's two main focus areas, and then I'll say a little bit about why we're particularly interested in funding research that examines ways to reduce inequality for young people. I'll then spend some time giving you an overview of the program and providing some insight into what it means to say whether or not your study is a fit with our interest. I'll give you some examples of funded studies and dig a little bit deeper into the kinds of things we share with you in our application guidance. I'll then spend some time talking about the application and review process. I'll direct you to some important resources on our website. And at the end, we'll have time for a fairly extensive question and answer period, during which I'll be joined by our president, Adam Gamoran, who will help field questions that you submit. In terms of submitting questions, I do want to let you know that you can submit questions at any time via the GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll answer as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A period. And please, again, do this throughout the webinar. I also want to let you know that you can access our 2023 application guidelines and a handout with links to the resources I'll mention during this webinar through the dashboard handouts section. We'll share a recording and slides from this webinar on our website next week. Everyone who registered will receive an email when the resources are posted. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 as a private grant-making foundation by William T. Grant, who was the owner of a chain of 5 and dime stores. Each year, we fund about $8.5 million in major research grants and about $15 million across all of our grant-making programs. Since the beginning, the foundation has worked to further understanding of human behavior through research. We do this by focusing on the most pressing challenges confronting young people. Specifically, we support high-quality, rigorous research that is relevant to improving outcomes for youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. In pursuit of this goal, we invest our research dollars in two focus areas. Our Use of Research Evidence initiative supports studies on strategies to improve the use of research evidence and policy and practice in ways that benefit youth. Our Reducing Inequality initiative, the initiative I'll be focusing on today, supports studies about ways programs, policies, and practices can reduce inequality and outcomes among young people in the United States. We have 3 major grants programs, and all applications for these programs must be a fit with one of these two focus areas. You should note that the Institutional Challenge Grant Program bridges our interest in both improving the use of research evidence and reducing inequality, and we'll be hosting a webinar on that program later in March. Today's webinar will focus on major research grants and officers' research awards in the Reducing Inequality focus area. Why are we interested in research on reducing inequality? This initiative was launched in 2014 after Adam Gamoran joined the foundation. The basis for this initiative is that inequality, on the basis of economic, racial, ethnic, and immigrant origins, in the United States is pervasive. Evidence often exists about the causes and consequences of this inequality, but the ways to reduce inequality are less well understood. We believe that we need research to identify and examine effective policies, programs, and practices to reduce inequality. I just want to underscore and emphasize this key point. The defining feature of this initiative is a focus on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. One way to think about this is that applicants might think about their starting point, like before their research takes place, that documents, there's a lot of research documenting the contours of, the explanations for inequality. Your study should then focus on identifying, testing, or building a response that addresses those inequalities. In this initiative, we seek research and we support studies that build, test, or improve programs, policies, and practices in youth-serving systems to reduce inequality in academic, behavioral, economic, or social outcomes among young people in the United States. Studies should build theoretical and empirical evidence on reducing inequality. The foundation is primarily interested in efforts to reduce inequality on the basis of economic standing, race, ethnicity, and immigrant origin. We are also interested in work that examines strategies to reduce inequalities for LGBTQ youth. We have a particular interest in this portfolio in research that addresses ways to combat systemic racism and the structural foundations of inequality, and I'll say just a little bit more about that special interest in a moment. We support a range of studies. The most important thing for us to keep in mind, and for you to keep in mind, is that we fund studies regardless of what methodological approach they use. What we're interested in is, are they a fit with our interest in reducing inequality? Are they using rigorous methods? And are the methods aligned with the research questions being asked? So for example, we support descriptive studies that might clarify mechanisms for why a particular program or practice works to reduce inequality. We support descriptive studies that might examine associations between programs, practices, and policies and outcomes. We support intervention studies that examine programs and policies and specifically test those attempts to reduce inequality using methods that support claims about cause and effect. We also support measurement studies of inequality that can enhance the work of researchers, practitioners, or policymakers to reduce inequality. And we also occasionally support synthesis studies that bring together literature on reducing inequality to advance the field. If you're thinking about submitting an application to the foundation, there are some important things you want to keep in mind about making the case that your research is a strong fit with our funding interest. First, we ask that you clarify and conceptualize the dimension or dimensions of inequality on which your study will focus. Reviewers like to see the dimension on which you are focusing clearly named and conceptualized. So for example, this means rather than saying my study will improve outcomes for disadvantaged youth, you specify which groups you're looking at: Black and Latinx youth, youth from low-income families, youth from particular countries, but you want to be very specific about the groups that you're focused on. We also want to see how the response you're examining will improve or is expected to improve outcomes for young people, either to reduce a gap between groups or to improve outcomes for a particular group of youth. Keep in mind that we support studies that examine responses to inequality in multiple systems and settings, including child welfare, neighborhoods, families, the labor market, etc. What's, again, most important for us to see is that the study will examine or develop a malleable lever with a well-theorized rationale for why that particular program, policy, or practice might bring about change. As I mentioned earlier, we've developed a special interest in this program on research that examines the roots of the structural roots of inequality in our country, or tries to address systemic racism. What we mean about that is that we're interested in studies that shift the focal point from individuals to large societal institutions. We developed this interest when we took stock of our initiative and what we had funded since this program began in 2019 and 2020. And one of the key things that we found is that despite many important findings in the studies that we funded, programs and practices to reduce inequality will have limited effect unless they can really address and advance the systems that underlie inequality in our country. So we encourage applications that take stock of this. This is not the only thing we fund, but if you have research where you're really trying to think about how to shift or change institutions that serve youth, the education system, the labor market, the political system, we welcome you to apply to the foundation and think about how to really begin targeting those deep structural roots of inequality. What I want to do now is turn to some templates you can use to think about whether or not your work might be a strong fit with our funding interest. Here's a sentence that you can use to fill in the blanks to help you think about whether your work is a fit with our interest in reducing inequality and in focusing on specific kinds of outcomes for specific groups of youth. So for example, this sentence, this project examines whether or how a particular program, policy, or practice reduces inequality and specific outcomes for specific groups of youth. If you can fill in the blank successfully, then your work is likely a fit with our interest. If you can't, then you might want to think about ways in which the work you're doing can resonate with our funding interest on examining responses to inequality. Here are a couple of examples of what this might look like. So, for example, a study might test whether a prosecutorial intervention reduces inequalities in incarceration rates for Black, Latinx, Indigenous youth compared to white youth. Outcomes are specific, the youth being examined are specific, and the specific type, the program, policy, or practice is specific. In this case, this would be, of course, an intervention study. Here's another example. This project explores the mechanisms by which civic engagement reduces inequalities in mental health outcomes for LGBTQ youth. So in this case, this would be a descriptive study where someone's exploring the processes through which a particular program, practice, policy is expected to improve outcomes for youth and digging more deeply into the mechanisms by which that occurs. Another thing that you want to consider is the question of how you're thinking about measuring outcomes. Now, most of the studies that we fund do measure whether or not outcomes are improved by a particular program, policy, or practice, or they're examining mechanisms through which a program, policy, or practice improves youth outcomes. But this does not always have to be the case. So, for example, if you have a strong theoretical or empirical argument to be made for why a given program, policy, or practice would eventually lead to improved youth outcomes beyond the study period, we're interested in hearing about that work. Here's an example of what I mean by that. So someone might be interested in examining a professional development intervention for teachers, where during the period of the grant, you're only going to be able to get at outcomes for whether or not teacher practices change. You may not be able to get to the specific outcomes for whether or not exclusionary discipline for youth of color is actually impacted. But based on the literature, you can make a strong argument that if you can indeed influence teachers to become less racist through an anti-racist professional development program, the hope is, and the expectation is, based on an established body of literature, that this will reduce racial disparities and disciplinary outcomes for students. Other studies that might do this, for example, are doing things like looking at the diversification of the teacher pipeline, although they may not necessarily be getting at the point of student outcomes during that particular study period, although there is a strong expectation that youth outcomes will be improved in the intermediate or longer term. Another thing you want to think about is whether or not you are specifying the youth that you're interested in and the specific dimension of inequality you're studying. So true or false, is your study a fit if you say this project is focusing on youth in general, or is focusing on vulnerable youth, at-risk youth, at-promise youth, etc.? This generally is not going to be a strong fit with our funding interests because these terms we feel are too broad and vague. Sometimes they're masking intentional categories, and so that we ask that you be specific about the youth you're examining, the specific inequality you're examining, and that you provide a compelling argument for why the program, policy, or practice you're examining is actually expected to improve outcomes for that particular group of youth. Another thing you want to do is think about, are you really getting at that question of, am I examining responses to inequality? So ask yourself, if your project is really about documenting the extent or impact of inequality, is it a fit with our funding interest? Guess what? The answer is false. Your project must focus on reducing inequality, responding to inequality, reducing inequality. I want to share with you now just a few examples of some studies we funded recently to help you get a sense of the kind of work we fund. I do also want to point you to our website and note that you can browse grants we funded. You can look at grants announcements, and I encourage applicants to do that to really get a good sense of the kind of work we fund, and also to show you that because this is a field-initiated process, we fund a lot of different kinds of studies, not just one particular type of study. And so that can give you a really good sense for the kind of work we're interested in. So in recent years, one of the descriptive studies we've funded examines the processes through which post-secondary institutions in Illinois are implementing organizational change to improve educational outcomes for Black and Latinx students. And so this is an interesting study that's using primarily qualitative work to really try to unpack how institutional change happens at colleges and universities to better and more equitably serve Black and Latinx students. Another example of a descriptive study we funded is a mixed method study that examines whether laws and policies that enhance tribal sovereignty can reduce family separation through the child welfare system. And this is a complicated study, mixed methods, interdisciplinary, that is really trying to advance our understanding of how to improve outcomes for Indigenous children who are often disproportionately affected by the child welfare system. An example of a program intervention study we funded examines whether an intervention to develop teachers' critical race consciousness and empathy for Black students reduces the racial discipline gap. This study is testing the intervention using randomized controlled trial, and it also has a qualitative component to really understand the processes through which change is or is not happening. Finally, we've also supported a number of policy intervention studies. One of the studies we funded is an examination of the effectiveness of prosecutorial reform initiatives across jurisdictions to reduce inequalities in justice system and labor market outcomes, and this is a quantitative study. I want to talk now and shift to talking about the application process. And I do want to note again that you're welcome to submit questions at any time through the dashboard. We'll spend a significant amount of time in a few minutes addressing the questions you have about the kinds of work we fund or about our application process. The initial stage of our application process for our major grants is a 5-page letter of inquiry. And you see this phrase repeated throughout all of our materials, 5-page letter of inquiry. If you are new to applying to grants, what this means is this is really a 5-page mini proposal, not a 5-page letter that you need to address to me or someone else at the foundation, but a 5-page mini proposal. We also use the term LOI to talk about these letters of inquiry. Deadlines for these submissions happen every year in January, May, and August, generally the first week, sometimes the second week, but early during the month, January, May, and August. Our next deadline, to take note, is May 3rd. We accept applications for major grant studies, which are studies you can see at the bottom of this slide that are award amounts of $100,000 to $600,000, and usually these studies last a period of 2 to 3 years. We also accept applications at our January and August deadlines for Officers Research Awards. Officers Research Awards are our smaller grants of $50,000 or less. These can be very good awards for early career researchers who are just sort of getting their feet wet in the world of grant making. They can also be good awards for exploring an element of a project or doing some pilot work and trying to get something off the ground. But these are smaller grants, and you're welcome to apply for those in January and August. When you submit your 5-page application for an officer's researcher grant, you do also need to submit budget materials, which are available in our grants management system. You do not need to do this when you submit an application for a major research grant. Those materials are not required unless we invite you to submit a full proposal. All of these things are outlined very clearly in our application guidance, but I did just want to call attention to that difference in the application process. One thing I do want to note is that we encourage people to take plenty of time to get proper institutional approval before you submit your application. Sometimes there are little snags on the end with doing this, so please be clear about what is required when you submit your application and make sure you have enough time to do that, working in partnership with your institution. I do want to note for both our officers research grants and our major grants, our funding should support research activities and work related to those research activities. We don't provide support through this grant program, for example, for program or just for general operating costs. These are grants meant to support research activities and things associated with that. And I want to encourage you to take a close read of our application guidance. We try to be very clear in that guidance, which we evaluate every year, about the materials that are required in applications and the kinds of things we look for when we're reviewing applications. So do take a close read of that and talk with other people in your department about thoughts they have about the kinds of things you might take into consideration when you're thinking about applying for this grant. Talk a little bit now about the review process. So when you submit a letter of inquiry for the major grants program, the first thing that happens, and actually the thing that happens for any letter of inquiry you submit, whether you're applying for a major grant or an officer's research award, is that your 5-page mini proposal is read by at least 2 members of our program staff. We review that application to evaluate it for whether or not it's a fit with our current interest and funding criteria. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes a little more, for us to get back with you. And at that stage, we get back with you to let you know for the major grants if we're inviting a full proposal or declining at that time. Unfortunately, we can't provide extensive feedback for cases where we are declining. We try to provide a little bit of feedback to give you insight so that you might further strengthen your proposal, either for applying again at the William T. Grant Foundation or elsewhere. If you apply for an Officer's Research Award, again, that application is also read by 2 members of our staff, but that process of getting back to you might take a little bit longer because we make decisions about whether or not to award funding, and sometimes that meeting process is a little bit more involved, but generally we try to get back to folks within 8 to 10 weeks after you submit an application for an Officer's Research Award. If you are invited to submit a full proposal, and we invite roughly 15% of applicants to submit a full proposal, we'll give you 2 options. This is our current practice. You have 2 options that you can submit your full proposal within 4 to 6 weeks of being invited to do so. So there's a pretty quick turnaround time in that case for submitting that full proposal. Or we may give you a date that's a few months out that gives you more time to develop that full proposal. But you have options about when to submit. When the full proposal comes into the foundation, program staff, so PhD level staff, look for potential external reviewers, because every proposal goes out to at least 2 external reviewers, and sometimes we seek an additional 3rd review depending on the research design. We seek reviewers who have content and methodological expertise so that they can evaluate and assess the proposed work. This process takes some time. Usually, we can be successful in immediately recruiting reviewers. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. And I just want to put a plug in now. If you're ever asked to review for the William T. Grant Foundation or other funders, I encourage you to do so, both because it will help you learn about the review process, and it's good practice and a valuable way to contribute to the academic field. Once those external reviews come back to us, and that process of recruiting reviewers and getting those reviews back takes 6 to 7 weeks, they undergo internal review by senior staff. Now, at this point, when I talk about senior staff, I'm talking about the PhD members of our staff who are part of the program team. This includes our president, our senior vice president of program, our 3 program officers, and it also includes 2 senior program associates who are external to the foundation, but who help us with the evaluation process for major grants. And you can see on our website who these folks are. So at this stage, when the proposals come back to us with external reviews, we make decisions about which proposals will move along in our review process. If members of our senior staff decide that a proposal is worthy of potentially moving through and being funded by our board, we send what we call an action letter to the principal investigator. The action letter highlights major concerns that reviewers have identified, and we also share the 2 external reviews with the applicant. In turn, the applicant is given about a month to respond to those concerns in a lengthy memo or perhaps by revising their proposal. And that comes back to the senior program team, who then reviews all the materials we have at that point, from the application to the external reviews to the internal reviews, to make decisions about which proposals we recommend to our board. Our board meetings are held 3 times a year in March, June, and October. And the senior program staff recommends proposals to the board for funding. So what this means is, from the time of submitting an application to hearing about whether or not you've been funded from our board, that process can take anywhere from 10 to 15 months, depending on when you submit your initial proposal. And sometimes along the way, if the proposal is not advancing through our review process, we try to let you know earlier. But that's a general overview of what our review process looks like. From start to finish, so if we're thinking about our major grants program, if you submit a letter of inquiry for our major grants program, roughly 3 to 5% of those applications ultimately get funded. If you submit an Officer's Research Award application, roughly 8 to 10% of those applications are funded for each cycle. I'll share some application tips quickly, and then just to let you know, we are getting closer and closer to the question and answer period, so please do submit any questions you have, and Adam and I will work through those with you. Here I am underscoring once again how important it is to read the application guidance and take advantage of resources on our website. All of the application guidance is important, but do note at the very end, we share application review criteria, which are based on the kinds of things we look at and talk about when we're making decisions about which letters of inquiry to invite for full proposal. And these are also factors that matter all the way through the review process, from letter of inquiry to making decisions about what proposals to recommend to the board. So those application review criteria are quite important. We encourage applicants to tackle a few research questions or hypotheses well, rather than trying to cover the waterfront. Because one of the things you should know, of course, that reviewers think about is how feasible the project is. Can this work be accomplished in the grant period? So you do want to carefully consider what you're asking and whether or not the methods you're using to answer questions can be accomplished during the grant period. It's also important to show the project's relevance for policy or practice. So one of the things we think about when a letter of inquiry comes in is, after we read the letter of inquiry, can we see how a proposed program, policy, or practice might be implemented in the youth serving system? Now, sometimes this is very clear because applicants are evaluating programs that are currently being implemented in schools, but sometimes this is less clear because the work may be at a different stage, or you're building a potential intervention to use. Well, what we'll want to see is it clear how this potential practice, for example, might be implemented in schools one day. So you want to make that link quite clear. Another thing we ask you to do, to the best of your ability, I know it kind of, I was once an academic well, I know how hard this can be, is to the extent that you can, please avoid using jargon or using it a lot in your application. People reading your applications are PhD level, but we are not all specialists in your area of interest. And so it's important that reviewers, whether or not they come from your specific discipline and your specific focus area, it's important that we can understand what you're doing and what you're talking about. So please be very clear, use plain language when you can, or define terms when particular terms are quite specific and important for the research. Be sure to define those things. One of the things that is critical for us in the review process is that the research design is clearly aligned with the research questions being asked. This is fundamentally important. It's something we look for internally, and it's something external reviewers evaluate very closely as well. So make sure your design methods and analyses are aligned tightly to the questions you're exploring. Again, we welcome methodological approaches of all kinds. What's important to us is that the methodological approach is the appropriate one to use for the questions asked, and that the work proposed is rigorous. You should also provide sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate the rigor and appropriateness of the methods. This is very important. They need to be able to understand what you're doing. I know a 5-page letter of inquiry is not that long, but you do want to be able to provide enough information that they feel confident you can carry out the work as proposed. Demonstrate your understanding of the strengths and limitations of the design method and analyses. So again, you don't have much room to do this in 5 pages, but if there is a significant limitation to the approach you're approaching, then acknowledge it and say what you're going to do to counter that. If your proposal moves through the review process and you are invited to send in an action letter and respond to concerns, I encourage you to respond to reviewers seriously, graciously, and in depth. It doesn't mean you have to accept every piece of feedback that is offered, but you do need to offer rationale for why you might not be doing that. I do want to direct you to our website before we move to the question and answer period. We have a lot of great resources here. Some of those resources are also shared with you through GoToWebinar in the document section. Check out the frequently asked questions, check out relevant papers and essays. We try to highlight and share with you writings that foundation staff have done, that others have done, that we think are important for understanding our funding and advancing the work that is important to us. Before we end, I want to note that the William T. Grant Foundation encourages proposals from teams with Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian American members in leadership roles. We also welcome and encourage multidisciplinary and mixed method studies. And finally, one thing I want to mention is that resubmissions are welcome. I know it can be discouraging to not be funded and receive that decline letter, but we do hope that you can take feedback to advance and strengthen your work. And I just encourage you to keep trying to get funding for the important work that you're doing. So let's turn now to our question and answer period. I'm happy to be joined by Adam Gamoran as we field questions you've asked during this presentation.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome to the 410 people who are participating in this webinar. Jenny, you've done a great job in laying out some basics. I'll start with just a few. There's been some confusion expressed in the question box about when people can apply. So I'll just explain and reiterate what you've already said, which is that the application guide is available now, not only in the resource handouts box of this webinar, but also on our website. The portal for submitting your letter of inquiry opens on March 8th. So you can't actually submit your letter of inquiry for a couple more weeks. The deadline, the last date for submitting your letter of inquiry is May 3rd. And as Jenny said, we do have 3 deadlines a year in January, May, and August. Officers Research Awards are applications for Officers Research Awards are accepted only at the January and August deadlines. So the next deadline for submitting an Officers Research Award will be in early August. So those are a few logistics that came up in the question box. Now, Jenny, a number of questions came up about the focus. What constitutes a dimension of inequality that would fit our criteria? So I'm going to shoot you 3 questions about that. First is, will a study on interventions to help first-generation college students with their college transition process be considered a study to reduce inequality?
Yes, we have funded studies that are examining first-generation college students, and generally, I mean, first-generation college students often are from, not necessarily, but from low-income families, or often come from groups that are historically underrepresented or in the college application and enrollment process. So generally, studies we have seen that have advanced in our process that focus on first-generation status are also looking at the ways in which that intersects with or overlaps with economic standing and or racial ethnic background or immigrant origin. So I would say like it's not a category itself that we prioritize, but to the extent that it often encapsulates the other categories that we prioritize, then yes, it would be a fit with our foundation interest.
And very much on the same theme, another questioner asks, can students with or at risk of having a learning disability, i.e. those with individualized educational programs in math, be considered a dimension of inequality? It goes without saying, this questioner asks, it goes without saying that those students are often from underrepresented groups and lowest SES.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So, and this also reminded me to share that one thing that we say in our application guidance is that while we have categories of youth we prioritize, we also welcome you to make a compelling case for why you may be examining a particular dimension of quality, which is not part of our priority, our stated priority interest. And of course, I mean, one thing I will say is, you know, we're a foundation with limited capacity, so we have to say these are the main things we're interested in. But we're also a foundation that is open to applicants making compelling cases about why a particular group you're examining is important to examine. Now, getting to this particular question asked, generally what we've done is we have considered studies fit with the foundation when they spell out the ways in which a student's ability status might overlap with those other categories. But again, you know, if your study, for example, we're solely focusing on students with disability status, then you would want to make a compelling case for why this is important to think about. But certainly, again, as you note, that that group encompasses groups that are often underrepresented in education. And again, what's important for us is really spelling out the ways in which that operates and the ways in which your study will address, for example, intersecting dimensions of inequality.
Thank you. Here's a different one that also addresses the target of the funding. Would the foundation be interested in research looking at pre-K practices that may have a positive impact on 5-year-olds in their transition to kindergarten. And I'm gonna specify this just for the sake of clarity. The intervention is taking place prior to age 5, but the outcomes are after age 5 or above.
So unfortunately, that would not be a fit with our funding interest. We're interested in interventions that take place during the period that youth are 5 to 25. So pre-K programs that have, or if you're looking at outcomes that take place when the youth are older than 5, that would not be a fit with our funding interest.
Right, so the key here is when the experience or intervention takes place, not when the outcomes are gathered. In fact, we would be open to outcomes that go beyond age 25 if the experience or intervention takes place within the age range of 5 to 25. So it's when the experience takes place. All right, one more of these. I am interested in submitting a comparative study, US versus France, about the impact of educational methods to reduce inequality. Would that qualify?
So I may have to turn to Adam on this one. So maybe, I mean, our funding interest is primarily on research that is focused on youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. We have those boundaries. And I mean, in my mind, and we try to be flexible. The comparable thing is sometimes we fund work that is looking at including an age range, maybe of 18 to 27, but most of the work is focused on youth ages 18 to 25. And so if you could make a strong case for why the work would be important in understanding reducing educational outcomes, for example, in the United States, then it would potentially be a fit with the foundation's interest. But Adam, you may want to qualify that.
Yeah, I would say following up on your example of the age range going partially outside our limit, we are restricted to funding research on young people ages 5 to 25 in the United States. A comparative study, we could fund the US part of the comparative study, but not the France part of the comparative study. So that, I think, is the best way to think about it. The fact that there might also be a parallel study taking place in France could enhance the interest in the research, but we wouldn't be able to fund that part of it. Okay. I was so interested in that one, I didn't tee up the next one. Okay. Okay, for this grant, so moving on to different kinds of questions. For this grant, is it advisable to focus on one specific program, policy, or practice? Or is it possible to focus on multiple programs, policies, or practices?
So generally, without knowing the details, my advice would be to encourage people to focus on one program, policy, or practice, because it would be very difficult to examine multiple programs, policies, and practices at the same time to really disentangle what it is that is potentially making a change among young people. Now, sometimes we do fund studies where people are testing different intervention components or potentially different interventions. But in those cases, you want to make a very strong case through your research design that you're able to disentangle those effects. So it's hard to imagine a case where a study would have a research design strong enough to really examine multiple kinds of programs, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Thank you. Good answer. Okay, there was one more on the first theme. This questioner asks, is youth experiencing unaccompanied homelessness a demographic the foundation would consider, or is that too vague according to the slide you presented earlier?
I think you would just want to flesh out what that means. I mean, clearly, youth who are experiencing homelessness are experiencing likely inequality by economic standing. So applications that we get for thinking about what it means to be unstably housed and how to reduce those inequalities often are encapsulated under that economic standing umbrella. And of course, I would imagine that this is also a category in which you're picking up perhaps youth of immigrant origin or youth who are disproportionately youth of color. So those are just the kinds of things you'll want to specify when you're making a case for why you're looking at this particular population.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And certainly youth experiencing unaccompanied homelessness is a very specific descriptor. It is not a vague descriptor, but you will want to lay out how that relates to the demographic characteristics of inequality. So here's a couple questions that I'm going to respond to briefly. One is, do you fund longitudinal studies? So yes, we fund longitudinal studies, but many longitudinal studies are omnibus studies that have many broad areas of focus. And unless and those typically have had a hard time getting through our funding process because they don't typically make a strong case for producing evidence on a program, policy, or practice that reduces inequality. But if your study will yield evidence of program, policy, or practice to reduce inequality, it is possible to make the case for funding for a longitudinal study as part of our Reducing Inequality competition. The second one I wanted to take on is kind of a chatty question, but it's one we're very interested in and concerned about, and it gives me an opportunity to give a heads up to people to watch our website. And this is, what do you think about what's happening in Florida and Texas and how that will affect people's ability to do important studies you are funding? So Jenny and I are very concerned with this. We've met on a number of occasions and even established a learning group among our grantees to address this challenge. But what the questioner is asking about doesn't say in the question, but it's about the hostility to anti-racist education, hostility to providing services for LGBTQ youth, general backlash to some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that have been made, especially since the tragic murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. So Florida and Texas are leaders, but these challenges are prevalent across the country. And this does, I agree that it's a challenge to our grantees who are pursuing research on ways to reduce racial, ethnic, and economic inequality, as well as inequality experienced by children of immigrant origins. So watch our website, because in the next few days we will be announcing a grant to take this head on. The grant will be led by Amy Stewart Wells at Teachers College and Janelle Scott at UC Berkeley, and the focus is on public learning for a multiracial democracy, and we hope this will answer some of the questions raised by this very questioner. Okay, there were questions about whether the letter of inquiry requires a full budget layout. I already said no, but here's a question that a little broader. In the letter of inquiry, can we add supplemental materials like a letter of support from a school collaborator or other supplemental materials beyond the 5-page letter?
The answer is yes, but don't go overboard doing this. If you do have a partnership with a school district or a school, for example, and you already have a letter of support, then you can include that. But I will also say commercially, you don't have to have that at the letter of inquiry stage. These are the kinds of things that people generally include with their full proposal. I also wouldn't, for the letter of inquiry, include multiple appendices where you're saying more about the research design, for example. But if you had a figure, a table, and you wanted to add that, that would be appropriate, but wouldn't make excessive use of additional pages for that letter of inquiry.
Thanks, Jenny. We have a question that asks about a specific study where the questioner wants to know whether we can cover costs of participating in the program. So could you answer that in a general fashion, Jenny? To what extent are our grants funding the services provided or the cost of participation, as opposed to the research about the effects or the experience of that participation?
Yeah, I mean, so most of the budget, or all of the budget, most of the budget does need to go to research costs. I mean, so sometimes this means You might be paying program staff because they're also helping with data collection or analysis for the research, or you're reimbursing youth, for example, who are participating in a youth participatory action research, and that research may also be part of a program. So there are ways in which you can potentially provide support in that direction, but we don't generally support program costs that is directly about funding a particular program. That is the kind of thing where we encourage people to submit to seek funding for that sort of expense elsewhere.
Thank you. And so, yeah, generally we want to fund the research, but sometimes there are program costs that are part of the study, and you can include those in your budget. Jenny, one of our questioners would like to know the basic statistics. They don't lay it out very specifically, but I think this is about what proportion of letters of inquiry generate invitations to submit full proposals, what proportion of full proposals in reducing inequality ultimately get funded. Could you speak to those details?
Sure. So we generally invite roughly 15% of applicants who submit a letter of inquiry to submit a full proposal. And about, I mean, this depends on a given cycle, but usually in the range of 20 to 22% of full proposals are end up being funded. This varies across years and across grant cycles, but that's on average roughly what our funding rate is. When I gave that statistic in the presentation of 3 to 5%, that is going all the way from the stage of getting a lot of letters of inquiry to whether or not those actually get funded. That percentage is around 3 to 5%. But of the full proposals that we receive, 20 to 25% are ultimately funded. Sometimes that number is a little higher, sometimes it's a little lower. It depends on the number of applications that come in at a given time.
Thank you. Just getting off a few of these in the question box. So if you've asked a question that we haven't taken up orally, you might watch the question box, because I've answered several of those there. Okay, so a questioner, let's say a questioner wants to know the following. Let's say I'm preparing a letter of inquiry for the May deadline. What is a realistic start date for the research project?
I'm always so bad about doing this in my head. Okay, so if you prepare something for the May deadline.
A letter of inquiry for the May deadline.
Yes, well, I can't. So I'm trying to think the realistic start date, and we offer information about this in our application guidance. I think it would be after March of the following year.
That makes sense. That would be about the absolute fastest.
The earliest.
Yeah. So the best case scenario would be April of 2024.
Right.
More realistically, sometime after April of 2024. Right. Because it depends if it gets if it generates a letter of inquiry, generates a full proposal, if you respond rapidly to the request for full proposal, if the reviews come in quickly, if you're able to respond to critiques, etc. So it depends how fast it goes, but the earliest possible would be April of the following year.
Right.
Earliest.
Right. So if you submit a letter of inquiry in May, the earliest date you would have as an option, because of the way, again, this is all about when the board meetings are and the cycles unfold. If you submit a letter of inquiry in May and it goes through the review process, you're invited to submit a full proposal, you would be given the option to submit your proposal in September or November. So proposals submitted in September then go through external and internal review and might be up for approval by the March board meeting, which, as Adam said, would be an April start date at the earliest.
Thank you. Jenny, there are a number of questions about who is eligible to apply, and I'm going to kind of bundle them together and respond to them quickly.
Great.
So proposals from independent scholars, we award funds to nonprofit organizations. We do not provide funds to individuals. So an independent scholar would have to have some kind of affiliation with a nonprofit in order to receive the award. What about community-based organizations? What about school districts? Yes, community-based organizations and school districts are eligible to receive awards. They would need to have the capacity to mount the research proposed in the reward, which is often not found in community-based organizations and school districts, but if they can demonstrate that capacity, yes, they are nonprofit or government organizations eligible to receive our awards. Let's see. So somebody wants more details on we do not fund program activities. I want to clarify. The purpose of the grant is to fund the research. If there is a budget necessary for program activities as part of the research, you are welcome to apply for that. If we got a proposal where the major portion of the fund was for the program and a minor portion of the grant was for the research, that would probably not be successful in our competition. But there is no specific line or percentage. Generally speaking, we're funding the research. Sometimes program costs have to be included in the research grant. Someone's asking about whether after school and summer educational settings would be of interest, and I want to say yes, indeed. And I want to emphasize so many of the questions we're getting are about education, and that's not surprising. About half of what we fund in the Reducing Inequality portfolio is about education. That's not surprising either. If you're funding research on youth, that's where the young people are. But we certainly are interested not only in after school and summer educational settings, but on any setting in which young people may be found, in the child welfare system, in the justice system, in neighborhood activities, in housing. So we have funded research in all of these domains. Our research is certainly not limited to education, let alone K-12 formal education. Are there other WT grant programs that go beyond youth? No. Yeah, so Jenny, there are some questions about the mechanics of the Officers Research Award. For example, more on what goes into them, or this person is asking, is funding decided solely by the letter of inquiry, or are you asked to submit a full proposal? Could you go into a little more detail about the decision process for Officers Research Awards?
Sure. Yes, the letter of inquiry is the application for the Officers Research Award. So you're not generally asked to provide additional information. Now, I will say sometimes when we're considering those applications for funding, we might come back with a couple of questions. But when you submit an application for an Officers Research Award at our January or August deadline, the 5-page document you submit is your application. So that is the case where, for example, if you're doing some work with a school district and you have a letter of support, or you have an appendix or two that would be important to share, then by all means include that. And you'll definitely need to include your budget materials. And if you look at our system and our application guidance, this means we have a budget template that you fill out that is like an Excel file that shows how you'll be using the money and how it's allocated. And you'll also submit a budget justification narrative that goes into more detail about how the funds will be spent. And one thing I failed to mention in the presentation is that whether you're applying for a major grant or an Officers Research grant, up to 15% of the budget can go towards indirect cost for your organization.
So here's a question that I'm thrilled to ask because it will allow you to talk about one of our other grant-making programs. Does the foundation support funds for research practice partnerships?
We have a grant program called the Institutional Challenge Grant Program. It's our newest grant program. We'll be making our 6th year of awards this year. And in this program, we support the building of partnerships between universities and community agencies or public agencies to advance research agendas, to reduce inequality for youth, and improve the use of research evidence in partner organizations. Another key component of this grant is that universities have to commit to institutional change to incentivize community engaged research. So there's a lot of information about the Institutional Challenge Grant Program on our website. As I mentioned, we'll be doing a webinar on this program later in March. But this is our vehicle for supporting research practice partnership work. This grant also includes funding for a planning period that takes place early in the grant, and these initial awards are for 3-year periods. with the opportunity to apply for a 2-year continuation. So this can be up to $1 million of funding over 5 years. And again, that's our institutional challenge grant program.
Thanks. So we have some questions about what do we mean by reducing inequality. So I'm going to say, as we explain in our information materials, you can think about reducing inequality in a couple of ways. One is a case where there is some disparity. For example, differences between blacks and whites in college completion. And the goal of the focus of the study is on some program, practice, or policy to reduce those disparities. And here you would want to examine the experiences of young people and see whether the disparities are reduced over time. The second way of thinking about this is that there's a traditionally underserved group. And so you're examining some policy to improve outcomes for that underserved group. And you don't necessarily need to show a disparity or because that in your research, because that is well documented in existing literature, and you would document that in your letter of inquiry. Your focus could be on that group. So somebody gave the earlier example of reducing vulnerability to homelessness for low-income youth. We wouldn't require you to show effects of such an experience for high-income youth. You know, the focus would be on serving this vulnerable population. So hopefully that clarifies what we mean by reducing inequality. Jenny, I'm afraid we have come to the end of our time. You have answered many questions. I guess I'll give you one last question because it addresses an issue that's been increasingly prominent in the research we support. And this is about systemic racism and the structural foundation of inequality. What are we looking for when we seek research to overturn the structural foundations of inequality and systemic racism?
This really is about studies, and we realize this is a complicated work, but it's really about studies that are looking at how to change systems that in ways that would acknowledge the deep roots of inequality. For example, in housing policies during the 1950s and 60s that disproportionately discriminated against Black families, or in other sorts of systemic-wide policies and practices that perpetuate institutional racism or inequality. How can we begin to tackle those things? And some of the studies we funded in this area are looking at how to shift policy at a federal level, really. And so, for example, to reduce child poverty through different kinds of programs to families, or looking at how to disrupt segregation and discrimination in the housing market. So it really is about tackling those big systemic questions and changing the way institutions operate. It's complicated.
Jenny, thank you so much for this terrific presentation. Thanks to all of our listeners for your engagement, and we look forward to receiving your letters of inquiry on May 3rd or before. And remember, we've got 3 deadlines a year. We'll see you all throughout.
Thank you.